Stop forcing everything. Let God take over. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the harder a mind insists it has no need of anything beyond itself, the more violently some substitute climbs onto the empty throne, dressed up as ambition, or discipline, or sheer grinding willpower. Jung wrote in Collected Works 13, paragraph 54, that the gods have become diseases, meaning what was once approached with reverence, given a temple, a season, a rest, now returns as compulsion when we deny it any dwelling place. So the very forcing you are so proud of, the calendar crammed, the outcome gripped white-knuckled, may not be strength at all. It may be an old hunger wearing modern clothes, a hunger for something to finally hold you, instead of you holding everything yourself. Before we go further, if this way of thinking is new to you, consider staying close by subscribing, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the same quiet way this one did. The first key is this: forcing is not devotion. It is the ego auditioning for a job that was never its own. Imagine a woman who plans her entire month down to the hour, who treats every uncertainty as an enemy to be managed, who cannot sit in a waiting room without also solving tomorrow's problem in her head. She calls this responsibility. But Jung would have asked what she is so afraid will happen if she simply stopped gripping for one afternoon. Notice the pattern more closely. She checks her phone before she is even fully awake. She rewrites the same email 4 times because a plain sentence feels like exposure. She cannot enjoy a Sunday without first accounting for every hour of the coming week. And if a friend suggests she simply wait and see, she feels something close to panic, not because waiting is dangerous, but because waiting requires trusting a process she is not personally steering. The ego, Jung taught, is a small chamber of consciousness, floating inside a much larger house called the psyche, and when that small chamber forgets it is small, when it starts acting like the whole house, it takes on a task no single room was built to carry, the task of guaranteeing the outcome of a life. This is why so much forcing produces exhaustion rather than peace. A room straining to do the work of a house will always ache at the seams. No wonder the shoulders tighten before difficult conversations. No wonder sleep will not come until the body has rehearsed every contingency twice. You were never meant to be the architect of everything that happens to you, only its honest inhabitant, and an inhabitant does not need to have built the walls to live inside them well. So let this be the quiet resolution I speak, and speak again. I release the ego from the job of being God. I release the ego from the job of being God. The second key is this: when the religious function of the psyche is denied a legitimate outlet, it does not vanish. It goes underground and resurfaces as something smaller and more demanding. Jung noticed this again and again in patients who told him they had left faith behind entirely and were free of it, and yet who could not stop needing a cause to worship, a diet to obey with the fervor of a monk, a career to serve as if it alone could confer salvation. The shrine had not closed, it had only moved, from the altar to the achievement, from the Sabbath to the sales quota. And the trouble with a hidden shrine is that it never announces its terms, it simply demands, and calls the demanding ambition. Jung wrote in Collected Works 11, paragraph 509, that among his patients, in the second half of life, every one of them fell ill for having lost a religious outlook on life, not a creed necessarily, not a church attendance record, but a working relationship with something larger than the personal will. And notice how ordinary the substitute can look from the outside. Imagine a woman who gave up on any faith years ago, who would tell you plainly that she believes in nothing beyond herself, and yet who cannot miss a single morning at the gym without a private wave of guilt that feels almost confessional, who tracks every calorie the way a monk once tracked every prayer hour, who feels something close to shame, not disappointment, shame. If the streak breaks, ask what exactly is being worshipped there. It is not health. Health does not require punishment for a missed day. It is devotion that has lost its temple and built itself a smaller one out of a treadmill and a tracking app. Imagine a man in his 50s who built 3 successful companies and cannot explain why none of it feels like enough. He assumes he simply has not built enough yet, so he starts a 4th. Jung would suspect instead that the man is trying to worship his own effort because nothing else has ever been offered a place at the table. The altar was never dismantled, it was only relabeled quarterly earnings, and here is what makes this so hard to see from inside it. The hidden shrine always dresses itself as virtue, discipline, ambition, self-improvement, so the person kneeling before it feels admirable rather than driven, feels responsible rather than compelled, and only notices the compulsion later, in the sleepless nights before a board meeting that should not carry this much weight, in the quiet dread of a single missed rep, a single missed quarter, a single missed morning. So here is a resolution worth saying quietly to yourself. I give the sacred a legitimate room instead of a hidden one. I give the sacred a legitimate room instead of a hidden one. The third key is this. There is a difference between believing something and encountering it, and forcing lives entirely on the belief side of that line. Jung was once asked on a BBC broadcast in 1959 whether he believed in God, and he answered, "I know. I don't need to believe. I know." A line that has traveled the world since, usually stripped of the sentence that made it honest, because a year later, in a piece for The Listener in 1960, Jung clarified that he was speaking of an inner experience, of what he called a factor unknown in itself, not a proof, not a doctrine, not a claim that could be argued in a courtroom, but a recognition, arriving the way weather arrives, unbidden and undeniable, while it is happening. Think of belief as a contract you sign with your own mind, a set of words you repeat until they hold, and think of encounter as something else entirely, something that happens to you, rather than something you produce. Imagine a man who spends years insisting to himself that his work has meaning, repeating it in the mirror before every difficult meeting, forcing the sentence into place like a nail hammered into wood that keeps splitting. He believes it, in the sense that he has decided to, but he has never once encountered it. He has never had the quiet, unasked moment where the meaning simply arrived and made itself known without his permission. And so the belief requires constant maintenance, constant repetition, constant defending against doubt. Because a belief you manufacture must be manufactured again tomorrow, and the day after, forever. This is the exhausting arithmetic of forcing. You cannot retire from a belief you built with your own hands. You can only keep building. Now imagine something different happening to that same man, not summoned, not scheduled, perhaps on an ordinary Tuesday evening, driving home in traffic, half listening to the radio, and without warning, a settledness arrives, a sense that the work, the marriage, the years are not senseless after all, and it is gone again within a minute, but something in him has been touched rather than convinced. That is what Jung meant by the numinous, an experience that does not ask your permission and does not wait for your schedule. And here is why this matters so much for anyone exhausted from forcing. You cannot argue your way into that kind of encounter, and you certainly cannot grip your way into it either. A man can force a deadline, he can force a diet, he can even force a marriage into a shape of politeness, but he cannot force the experience of being met by something larger than his own planning, that only comes when the grip loosens enough for something else to be noticed at all. The very gripping is what keeps the window shut, because a hand clenched tight around an outcome has no room left to receive anything unasked. So much of the forcing in an ordinary week is really this same mistake, wearing smaller clothes, trying to convince yourself of a peace you have not been given, trying to talk yourself into a certainty that was never meant to be manufactured, when the honest work is not persuasion at all. It is attention. It is the quiet discipline of staying awake enough, still enough, unhurried enough, that if something does arrive uninvited, you are actually present to notice it, rather than too busy proving something to yourself to feel it pass by. So let the resolution be this one. I stop demanding proof and start making room for encounter. I stop demanding proof and start making room for encounter. The fourth key is this, and here the lens turns toward you rather than toward patience in old case notes. Think back over this past week. Was there a moment you refused to let a plan bend even slightly? A moment you treated a minor delay as a personal insult? A moment you stayed up rehearsing an outcome you have no actual power to guarantee? That is the grip Jung was describing. And it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like competence. It looks like a person who simply gets things done. But underneath the competence, there is often a quiet terror that if the hands ever open, everything falls. Jung recalled in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that his own father, a country pastor, had performed the forms of faith for decades, while privately having lost the living experience behind them. And Jung watched, as a boy, the exhaustion this produced, a man going through every motion of surrender, while gripping, invisibly, with everything he had, reciting the words of trust on Sunday, and returning Monday to a private despair he never once let anyone see. That image stayed with Jung his whole life. The danger of holding the form of letting go while still clenching the substance of control. And it is worth sitting with how ordinary this pattern looks, once you know to watch for it. Imagine a father today who tells his children not to worry, that everything will be fine, while he lies awake at 3 a.m, recalculating the mortgage for the 4th time that week. The words of ease leaving his mouth, while his whole body stays braced. This is not hypocrisy exactly. Jung would say, it is simply the split between the persona a person shows and the grip that person actually carries underneath. And most of us do not need Jung's father to recognize it. We have our own quieter version. The way you tell a friend you are not worried about it, while checking your phone every few minutes for a reply that has not come. The way you say you have let it go about a conversation that still runs on a loop in your head at midnight. The mouth releases the thing before the hand ever does. Ask yourself honestly this week where you are doing the same, where you are saying the words of trust while your hands stay locked around the steering wheel. Notice it in the small places first, because the grip rarely announces itself in the large decisions. It shows up in the way you refuse to let someone else load the dishwasher their own way, in the way a delayed reply from a colleague sends a small current of dread through your chest, in the way you cannot enjoy a Saturday without first accounting for every hour of the following Monday. None of these are crimes, and none of them make you a fraud, the way the pastor's private despair might sound. This is not a failing to be ashamed of. It is simply the ego doing what it was trained to do, protect at all costs. The ego learned somewhere, probably very young, that safety comes from vigilance, and it has been dutifully vigilant ever since, refusing to notice that the vigilance itself has become the exhausting thing. But it is worth naming, because you cannot loosen a grip you refuse to notice you have. A hand does not open by being commanded to open. It opens once it finally feels safe enough to stop bracing, and that safety begins with the small, unglamorous act of simply noticing, without judgment, this week, where the bracing is happening. So here is the resolution. I notice where my hands are clenched before I ask them to open. I notice where my hands are clenched before I ask them to open. The fifth key is this. Letting something larger take over does not mean going limp. And this is where the popular phrase does the most damage, because Jung never taught passivity, he taught cooperation. There is a very real difference between surrender and collapse, and most people who hear let go imagine the second when Jung meant the first. Imagine a sailor who has spent the whole voyage fighting the wheel, exhausted, soaked, furious at the wind for not obeying him, cursing the current as though it owed him an apology. And imagine that same sailor learning, finally, to read the wind instead of fighting it, to adjust the sail rather than command the sea. Notice he is not doing less, he is doing considerably more work. Work of attention, work of listening, work of small constant adjustment, rather than one great exhausting grip held for hours. This is what Jung meant by relationship with the unconscious, and by extension, with what religious language calls the divine. The ego's proper task was never to manufacture the outcome. Its task was to notice what is already moving and align with it honestly. This is why Jung took dreams so seriously, and inner images, and the quiet promptings that arrive unasked, because these are the wind. They are the psyche's own weather report, arriving nightly, whether the ego consents or not, and a life spent only forcing never learns to read them. It sails on regardless, gripping the wheel through a storm that a single glance at the sky would have predicted. Imagine a woman who dreams 3 separate times of losing her keys in the same unfamiliar house, and dismisses each dream as noise because she has a schedule to keep, and then wonders, months later, why she feels locked out of her own life. The dream was not a warning from outside, it was the wind she refused to read. Jung would say the unconscious had been trying to adjust her sail for months, quietly, patiently, while she kept both hands on a wheel that was steering her nowhere new. Consider too the ordinary version of this. A man forces his career forward for 20 years and calls it drive, never once asking whether the direction itself still fits who he has become. He measures progress only by speed, never by heading, and then wonders, at 50, why arriving at the destination feels like arriving nowhere at all. The forcing was never the problem in itself. Effort is not the enemy here. The problem was effort spent, with no ear turned toward whether the effort still served anything real. Cooperation asks a harder question than force does. It asks not, how do I make this happen, but what is already trying to happen here, and am I willing to notice it? And that second question is far more uncomfortable than the first, because it requires admitting you might not already know best. It requires a kind of humility the gripping hand never has time for. That question cannot be answered by gripping harder. No amount of white-knuckled determination will make a closed door read as open. It can only be answered by going quiet enough to hear, by sitting with an unresolved evening instead of filling it, by writing down a dream instead of rushing past it, by noticing the small resistance in the body before forcing the calendar to swallow it whole. This is not resignation. The sailor still trims the sail, still holds the tiller, still gets soaked by the same storm, but he is no longer at war with the sea. He has stopped mistaking the wind for an enemy and started treating it as information. That shift alone, Jung taught, changes exhaustion into something closer to partnership. So speak this resolution with me. I trade the wheel I fight for the wind I finally listen to. I trade the wheel I fight for the wind I finally listen to. The 6th key is this, and it is the one that gathers everything else into a single working practice you can actually carry into your week. Jung once described a private test he used for himself, recorded in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Near its closing pages, he asked whether a person felt related to something infinite, and he noted that this single question changes the entire shape of a life. Not because it grants magical protection, and not because answering yes makes the bills disappear, but because a person who feels related to something infinite handles the finite differently. The missed promotion is still disappointing, but it is no longer the whole verdict on a life. The difficult marriage is still difficult, but it is no longer proof that existence itself has failed. Forcing, at its root, is often what happens when a person believes the finite thing in front of them is the entire universe, and so it must be controlled completely, or all is lost. Letting the larger pattern take its rightful place restores proportion, not by shrinking your effort, but by shrinking your terror. Imagine a father sitting up at midnight because his son has not answered a text since morning. He has already rehearsed 3 tragedies in his head. He has already composed the message he will send the moment the boy resurfaces, and underneath the worry, if he is honest, there is a smaller, harder demand, the demand that his son's life go exactly the way the father has planned it, that nothing be allowed to happen outside that plan. This is not really love in that moment. Though it wears love's clothing, it is the ego treating one relationship as though it were the whole of existence, and so every silence becomes an emergency, requiring total vigilance. Now imagine that same father, an hour later, stepping outside for air, looking up, noticing that the sky has not stopped being vast simply because his phone stayed quiet, noticing that whatever is unfolding in his son's life is still unfolding inside a much larger pattern than any single text message can carry. This does not make him stop caring, and Jung was never asking anyone to stop caring. It simply returns the moment to its true size. One room, lit or unlit, inside a house that is still standing. Try this quietly yourself, without announcing it to anyone, without turning it into a performance. Simply ask across this coming week, in the middle of an ordinary moment, stuck in traffic, waiting on a reply that has not come, watching a plan bend sideways without your permission. Ask, am I relating to this moment as though it is the whole of existence, or am I relating to it as one small room inside a much larger house? Notice how the question does not ask you to solve anything. It only asks you to remember scale. A man forcing a business deal through by Friday believes, for that hour, that Friday is the entire timeline of his worth. A woman gripping a conversation toward the apology she is owed believes, for that hour, that this single exchange is the whole of her dignity. The question does not deny that these moments matter. It simply refuses to let any one of them swallow the sky whole. Jung never promised that this question dissolves difficulty. He only observed that it changes what difficulty is allowed to mean. This is the entire difference between forcing and cooperating. Forcing treats every obstacle as an emergency, because nothing larger is presumed to be holding the frame. Cooperating treats the obstacle as one weather pattern inside a sky that continues regardless. And the strange relief in this is that you do not have to feel the infinite constantly for the question to work. You only have to remember, in the ordinary moment, that it exists at all, the way a person does not need to see the ocean to know it is still there past the hill. And so the grip, slowly, without any dramatic surrender, without any collapse, simply loosens, because it no longer has to hold up the whole sky by itself. The shoulders come down, not because the problem vanished, but because the problem was never asked to be everything. So let the resolution here be the deepest one. I remember I am one room, not the whole house. I remember I am one room, not the whole house. Here is the whole picture. Forcing is the ego mistaking itself for the entire psyche. The sacred denied a proper room returns wearing the mask of ambition. Believing is not the same as encountering, and only one of them can be forced. Your clenched hands this week are simply the ego protecting what it fears will otherwise fall. Cooperation reads the wind instead of fighting the wheel, and the whole of it rests on one honest question asked quietly in ordinary moments. Am I relating to this as the entire universe, or as one room inside a larger house? Jung wrote that the gods have become diseases when they are given no legitimate home, and perhaps the gentlest thing you can do this week is not to force an answer to any of this, but simply to notice, without gripping, where the larger pattern has been trying to hold you all along, while your hands were too busy holding everything themselves, and that, quietly, is what it means to stop forcing and let something larger finally take its place.